noticed there was a provision missing in item B under new business in the resolution. I'll cover that later, but I just note that that's been uploaded and changed since what you would have previously seen this weekend. Otherwise, no substantive changes to the agenda.
Okay, I'll go ahead and move that we approve the agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. We'll proceed accordingly. Next on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the September 5th Planning Commission meeting. Anybody have any adjustments or additions? Hearing none, I'll go ahead and move that we approve the minutes of the September 5th Planning Commission meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Next, we have new business. A couple items tonight. First up is Hill Point with the final plat.
Thank you. Tonight we will be reviewing the final plat for the Hill Point development. A quick reminder of where we've seen this project before. The Planning Commission and Neighborhood both reviewed this project on March 21st as a sketch plat. If you'll remember, the development team came forward with 3 options and wanted to work through the 3 different options with the Planning Commission, Neighborhood Group, and City Council. So that was on March 21st. The City Council also reviewed the sketch plat, and the developer chose to move forward with the large single-family lots, similar to our R1 zoning district today. The preliminary plat and rezoning request came before the Planning Commission on June 20th and the City Council on June 26th. The preliminary plat and rezoning were both approved by the Council on the 26th. So tonight we are at the final plat stage. Some detail about the Hill Point development. It is directly east of the Greenway on the Park development located adjacent to Bavaria. In total, there are 24 lots for development. 22 are home sites that will be remaining, 2 are home sites that will be remaining, 22 new construction lots. So the 2 home sites that will be remaining are here on the north portion of the property and here to the west. So just to keep that in mind, it's 24 total, but 22 new construction lots. Like I stated before, the development has been rezoned to R1. So on the screen right now, you'll see the provisions from our city code outlining the R1 district as well as the Hill Point development. You'll see the front yard and rear yard setbacks are both 30 feet, side yard 10, impervious surface max of 35%. The numbers that you're seeing tonight are similar to most of the development that we've seen in Victoria in the past decade with that large single-family lot. Moving forward to the final plat for reference. The final plat is consistent with the preliminary plat. There are no large changes from the time that we saw it at the June 20th meeting. For reference and a small caveat, at the September 11th City Council meeting, there was a lot split that occurred for the Vanderlinde home site here. So essentially it created a lot for that house to remain. So gave it some lot lines and it will continue to exist through the development of the project. Some additional detail about the project. Parkland dedication will be met with this project like every other development site in Victoria. In our city code, it does state that 25% of the dedication requirement can be met by trail within the site. Hill Point will be working towards that 25%. And also providing trail outside of the development. So through this exception property, Hill Point will be developing the trail, which will lead to a greater connection to the Greenway on the Park development. So it'll create a nice loop, whereas opposed to if it was just within the development, it would stop here as opposed to connecting into the Greenway on the Park. Again, the development does meet our R1 zoning regulations. The developer was really active when we were working to update that and did work to make sure that the bulk regulations were consistent. Some information from the landscape plan. You'll find there's significant buffering along Bavaria as well as boulevard trees throughout the development. This also took place at the time that we were revising the open space and landscape ordinance. This development does meet all specifications that are outlined in that section. Some home examples that have been provided by the development team for what the homes might look like in the Hill Point development. and moving into some conditions of the final plat. So most of the conditions are pretty standard for development, typical to what we've seen. The first being the step of executing a final development agreement. That the two is that it shall conform to the city's adopted R1 regulations, which it was rezoned as. 3 is all permits and approval from applicable government agencies. 4, additional review by the city engineer, city staff, city consultants. 5 speaks to the outlot A that will be deeded to the city for open space wetlands, wetland buffer, and stormwater management. Outlot B will be retained under ownership of the developer. 7 is the parkland dedication that I touched on, which is being met through trail both within the project and outside of the development. And 8 speaks to the compliance with the final landscape plan. So at this time, staff has reviewed the final plat, and based on the consistency with the preliminary plat and conformance with the R1 zoning regulations, staff would recommend approval of the final plat for Hill Point. Terry Hartman is in the room tonight. He's with the development team if you have specific project questions. Otherwise, I'll open it up for discussion, questions, comments.
Thank you, Aaron. Any initial thoughts or questions?
So the trail section that would not normally be developed or wouldn't have to be, the Hartmans are doing that on themselves to make it connective and more attractive.
Correct.
And that's great.
Does that trail go all the way up to then to the alley lane area? Just kind of wrap my head around where there
So-
may still be gaps, if any.
It heads towards D-Town Park and the rec center. So the trail that goes from Bavaria all the way to the west and then ties into the greater trail system within the city. So
I'm sorry, can you?
Yep, so here's the trail connection at Alley Lane.
Yep.
And then it goes behind all the homes and then out into D-Town Park, and you can see the connection
Okay.
towards the rec center.
And then on the east side of Bavaria, so the trail goes all the way up to the point where it
Goes up to this point here.
Okay, then
There'll be a crossing.
Okay.
Yep, and then ties into that loop.
And on the south side, does it go all the way down to the existing end of the sidewalk that's there now?
Correct. So Chaska has a trail system that comes up to that intersection, and this would be a connection from that point up to the north.
Okay. So in essence, we're connecting that.
We're linking everything. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Just one quick one. That house that's going to remain on the north, if I remember correctly, the development runs from the street all the way to where the kind of the woods are on where the trees are on the right. That driveway that's accessing Bavaria, is that going to be eliminated and it'll be accessed through the kind of the circular street? Okay.
Yes. It'll be accessed from the new street.
Okay. And if I remember right and going through the material for the meeting today, those two homeowners were contacted, right? And did they respond?
The two homes that are retaining, one is owned by the developer currently.
That won't
the
be a
southern
problem,
property owner, and
obviously.
the other is being included as part of the development group.
And did they respond? Oh, never mind. You answered the question. Sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Can you refresh my memories on, I know you talked about it, but the turn lanes going into the neighborhood, is it going to be northbound turn lane and then is there a slip lane coming south or?
Go ahead.
So there is, similar to most of the full access points along Bavaria, whether it's the county portion to the north from 82nd up to Highway 5 or anything that would be south of this project into Chaska, right turn lanes or a decel lane is kind of the mode of how we accommodate those movements. As part of this project, the developer is constructing a right-hand turn lane for northbound traffic, so they will be able to pull over to the side and into this project without disrupting through movements.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One question I had was when we think about the future development and specifically that undeveloped portion in the middle of the of the site. Are we setting ourselves up for a potential need to exceed the 3-home limit on a private drive?
Potentially. There's enough width there that there could be 2 lots. I think for the way things are today, it being the 1 lot and the developer doesn't necessarily have control of that portion today, having that 1 access on the private drive instead of long-term forcing that lot to access directly from Bavaria, I think is a better position to be in for the city. And should that property owner decide they do want to subdivide, connect to public utilities, I think that's just a worthwhile conversation to have at that time, that 4 on a private drive is better than 2 having individual access points onto Bavaria. But generally, this developer has accommodated what our ordinance says of 3 coming off of that first private drive.
Do we think that it's likely that in the future, if that site were further developed, there would not be access allowed? Because I suppose that if that lot were split, that one property could be the 3rd on the private drive, and there may be another property that has access to Bavaria as
So-
another scenario.
I can answer the question, but Terry, it might be better if you want to elaborate on what you've started to build in terms of the provisions of that private drive easement, just thinking more long-term than what we see today.
That is a private driveway. Each of those owners in there, or the second one in, has access by easement, private easement across the first lot. But the city, we're also putting in public utilities in that easement to serve that second house. We're also taking them and extending them to it's called the Jason Stevens property. We're extending them to his line so that he does have access to public utilities. And, we've talked to him, and part of the good planning that we worked out with Ben, just the same as extending the trail, because it really should be extended across his property. Doing this will serve him in the future. What we need to do for those 2 owners who use that private driveway, though, is create a shared driveway easement where it's not a whole association needed for just one driveway cost sharing, but we're creating one for those 2 owners with the provision that Stevens' property could be added to that. And if he decides to split that and it ends up to be 4 houses that are using that, I don't think that's a big concern for our 2 homeowners. I don't think it's a big deviation from what
Okay.
we normally see there.
And the
So we'd be
mechanics.
prepared to take both those on that private driveway.
So basically, the mechanics are set up through that easement document that if there ends up being 4, that easement allows the 4 to share in equal costs of what that shared portion of the driveway is serving them.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is just that there's enough foresight there to have some flexibility as that may likely develop, that we're not sort of precluding what can or can't happen there. So
Yeah,
it's good.
the requirements is much more than just a typical driveway. It's 20 feet wide, curb and gutter on one side, big heavy base. So adding 2 more houses to it, it's not.
Yeah, and so there'll be that common understanding up front for those 2 homeowners that there's the potential for additional access in the future. And so that kind of
Yeah.
lays the groundwork for it to happen.
A little bit more traffic, but it's only 2 houses.
Yeah. Thank you.
See, Terry, while you're there, I have another question for you, and it might just be that I can't read it in the staff report, but I'm looking at the northern, I don't know if it's a driveway or a street coming to the west, and there's text, and it looks like an easement going to Bavaria. Is that a utility easement? That's
Yeah, it would be in a utility easement, not access.
not access easement?
Yeah,
Okay.
because we have to bring utilities over to that alley lane to hook up to sewer and water.
Okay.
So they're going to extend through that private driveway and across that property.
That's what I thought. I just couldn't read it, so I just wanted to make sure I understood what that easement was for. It's not for access, it's
Not
for
for access,
utilities.
no.
Okay.
And there's a 50-foot gas main easement that runs along the north portion of the project. So that might be the other line work that you're seeing there.
Yeah, I get
Called out as an
easements on top of easements on top of
There's a few lines there, and then I
Yep.
can't
You
read
have to
it.
think in terms of layers.
right.
Very good, thank you.
I didn't have any other questions. Anybody else? Additional thoughts? Are we ready for a motion?
Well, if everyone's accepting, I'll make a motion to approve resolution number 17-15, a resolution recommending approval of a final plat for Hill Point as submitted by Hardman Communities with the 8 following noted conditions.
Thanks, Todd. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. This will go forward, I assume, to the next city council meeting?
Next Monday.
Great. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, Terry.
All right, moving on to the next item in our agenda under new business is the Creamery Building addition, site plan and building materials, and parking conditional use permit. Who's going to walk us through this one? Aaron?
I will.
Ben, your turn. You're up.
All right. So most of you should be very familiar with the Creamery site in general, but we'll walk through a little bit just existing conditions. Site has been used by the current property ownership since about the mid-2000s. There had been a proposal, as noted in the staff report, for a full redevelopment of the site where the existing building or Creamery building would be torn down, and then had contemplated 2 buildings being constructed on site in its place. Based on market conditions and a few other things, the ownership group didn't move forward with constructing that proposal, obviously. The building itself ended up sitting vacant for a couple of years before Enki ended up starting their operations in the building. I think that really brought more awareness for the community as to what kind of the feeling of having that more historic type building remain on that site. More recently, since Enki has moved their operations out, the ownership group has tried to contemplate what's the best move forward for still utilizing that building. And I think the proposal you'll see tonight of seeing a small addition kind of on the south portion of the building that translates the existing space into a restaurant on the main level and some office space upstairs really starts to get at what we've heard, at least from the community, of wanting to keep as much of the existing building intact and in place, keep kind of that character going within that central part of downtown. On the slide before you, generalized in kind of that red outline is the property boundaries of this site. The building's north wall, the existing building's north wall, is very close to about that halfway point of that property from north to south. It has today, so if you recall going there maybe when Enki used the building, there's an existing gravel driveway access right off of the alley. You can see the striped out portion that allowed for that through movement, and then occasionally, and even on this aerial, you can see a couple vehicles being parked in kind of that gravel area on the east side of the site. There's also an existing driveway that had been used more as kind of a loading drive lane to get people into and out of the building as it had been used as a brewery. Some of those components will follow through with the redevelopment plan here. There's not a sidewalk today that would link you, so if you, say, parked in this parking lot and came up the sidewalk and wanted to navigate yourself over towards the Main Street building that actually exists, not on this Google aerial, but something on the Main Street building, there's not a direct route. And what you'll see with this redevelopment plan before you tonight, that we do have that solution accounted for there. If you don't have any questions just about existing conditions, just kind of outline what the proposal is today. So this graphic was included in the staff report. Generally kind of this lighter or darker gray, square is the existing footprint of the Creamery building today. Kind of the red outline shows where those additions end up being made, and then some additional pavement areas. There's a patio contemplated on the northeast corner of the building, as well as the southwest corner of the building. The existing drive aisle that I spoke about from Victoria Drive near the intersection with Steger Lake Lane is here and is proposed to get enlarged. That provides direct access to a new trash enclosure that would be built and help to support some of the restaurant needs there. On the south side of the project, and there is a close-up site plan or more detailed site plan that was included in your packet, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more. But that sidewalk connection providing access down to the main entrance of the building that will still remain on the south to allow that ease of access either from west to east or east to west in those directions is also being provided. Here's a more wide view of that site plan. A lot of the things that are on this I highlighted with the aerial. This is one of the two more detailed site plans that are included in the packet of information. Here you can see the route of that walk that goes across the front of the building. Due to the elevation of the existing street and where the entrance to that building is, that's why if you paid attention to some of the grade work that's being done, we're ramping down toward the entrance to the building because there is a couple feet of grade separation. In order to provide direct access from the on-street parking on Tower to the sidewalk and or the building, there is a graduated staircase, somewhat similar to what you'd see across the street at the Main Street building. Just because of the grades, that was the only way to provide more of a contiguous access from the back of curb towards the building. So here, and the line work is not specifically easy to digest right away, but once you understand kind of this first stretch across the first 2.5 stalls will be very similar to the grade of the existing sidewalk. So think of it just as a wider sidewalk on that stretch. Then we end up with basically a wide landing spot. So if you're walking from the on-street parking, you'd basically stand on about a 2.5 foot wide landing area, then take one step down. And then as you get to this far west side of that parking bay, you have basically a foot of concrete that you can step on, and then you'd take your stairs, 3 stairs down to that sidewalk. There would be railings kind of denoting where those stairs start and stop, so to speak, similar to what you'd see at the Main Street building, some visual cues being built into the design there to help ease kind of that irregular access solution. On the west side of the site, what's easier to see on this is there is a desire of the applicant to install more of a planter wall. So it'd be an elevated planter bed that would have some perennial plantings in it, but provide some screening between a concrete patio that, similar to the sidewalk we just talked about, sits a little bit below the sidewalk adjacent to it. So we're providing more of a physical barrier so people aren't walking too far off from that grade separation. Back to the east side, just one thing to call out as we start talking about parking. The existing access is going to be abandoned on the east side of the site, so the applicant is proposing to extend curb and gutter along kind of that existing access drive, and that would create 2 additional parking spaces on the alley there. And hopefully it was somewhat easy to digest just the brief overview that was in the staff report. On the top part of this is just the general requirements based upon the floor plan being submitted of what the parking requirements are per our downtown business area. So for the building as it's being presented, 38 stalls is basically what they would need to accommodate. As noted just previously, they are providing 2 additional stalls that don't exist today along that alley. The lower part here, if you read through the provisions of our off-street parking and loading areas ordinance, there's an acknowledgement that when the city took on all the street improvements, we created all the on-street parking, there was a base level of development and some assumptions made about which sites have access to certain amounts of parking. In terms of talking about the creamery, if you think about Inky being there kind of in the as-is condition, they had access to roughly 34 spaces. So that was their base level of parking that they had access to. Given some of the reconfiguring of the building and the addition and these parking requirements, they're basically short of 4 shared parking spaces that were in that base level development that would have been enacted in kind of the mid 2000s. As part of the process here, they have submitted their conditional use permit. There would be a public hearing held by the Planning Commission, just allowing anyone to talk about what that parking demand is. What the ordinance calls for is really the applicant to submit what they have for parking demand and then staff to evaluate, is there adequate capacity? After looking through the information, I can be a little bit more specific tonight, but looking at total stalls that are in downtown, we have 360 total parking stalls. And usually what happens, I went through an analysis of what are the parking demands at key periods, so morning, afternoon, night. Most of the time at night and in the afternoon is where we have the biggest demand for parking here. If you think about particularly this being a restaurant, lunch tends to be fairly good, but we also have a lot of employment downtown at the same time. And then at night, certainly the dinner crowd is going to be much heavier than what the lunch crowd ends up being. With all the restaurants downtown, so if there are 360 stalls total, all the restaurants at 100%, not our reduced parking requirement, 100% demand, so every restaurant is packed, we would need 281 stalls to accommodate all of the restaurants, including what is proposed tonight in this main level restaurant. So based upon my analysis, I would say for all of our peak times, we do have adequate capacity, knowing also that the city is looking at completing the Rose Street parking lot improvements later this fall that adds some additional capacity, as well as looking at next spring taking on potentially a permanent conversion of that one-way that will add some parking capacity adjacent to the site, and opening up some additional parking along Steger Lake Lane for other uses in kind of this northeast corner of downtown. I feel comfortable with looking at the 4 spaces being existing that can meet the demands of the new use. If you don't have any questions there.
Do those numbers include any reserve parking? For example, if the grocery store comes back, there's reserve parking for grocery store?
Correct. So of the total parking that I talked about, there's 105 spaces total that are private. So that's between the grocery store. Floyd's has some private parking. Okay. There's a couple spaces behind the post office and dentist office that would be in that total. So we're still within that threshold of being able to accommodate those various uses.
Thank you.
Well, I was just to say it in a slightly different way.
Yep.
Am I just to check and balance, make sure I'm understanding it right? So the 34 private spaces that are being provided are counted in the 105 or 108 private spaces.
The 34 spaces are part of public shared parking. So when all of downtown was built, the streets as we see them, all the streetscape elements, the on-street parking was constructed, there was an evaluation that there were 34 public parking spaces available to this site, because what I didn't say before is originally this site was larger. So all of the parking stalls that are along the alley, the 20, what will end up being 22 spaces, that originally was part of this property. So the council, the city at that time had made an acknowledgement that they needed some additional property to put the streets where they are, add the additional parking, and they didn't want to remove what that benefit was to existing conditions that were there. So because the Creamery site is an existing condition, they had access to 34 spaces of shared parking.
Okay. So of the 235 that are public, 38 of those will be required for the Creamery.
Correct.
And so is it true then that there are not any designated spaces for the this new restaurant?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that public parking pool, it's really a numbers game. There's not any perfect way to create, say, an exhibit and say, here's exactly where the 38 spaces end up being always. It's more of, do we have reasonable access within a couple blocks to accommodate those 38 that doesn't compete with other uses?
Yeah, I was going to say this question, but I feel like now is the best time to ask it. So when it comes to accessible parking, how does that work in a condition like this where
Correct.
I mean, traditionally you'd have dedicated parking for a place of business, and there'd be a minimum requirement for accessible parking in a certain proximity to the front door of that business.
Correct.
How does it work in this scenario with a
So
shared?
because it's in the public realm, all of our public parking, if we did the full breakdown of what of that 255 public spaces that are in downtown, we have been evaluating what our numbers of accessible parking is, and usually we're trying to position them in the closest area to the front of this door. So there are accessible parking spaces across the street that someone could take the sidewalk to the front door of this new building. And then on the northeast corner, right off the alley, there are 2 accessible parking spaces there as well.
So as part of this development, it's not required that there's accessible parking within directly adjacent to the site with a clear path to the front door?
It would be, and they would satisfy it with the alley parking that is directly abutting the site, and you can take the sidewalk. It'd be
Okay.
like, it's probably a bad example for downtown, but Applebee's. Think about where some of those parking, sometimes it's right in front of the door, and some other uses, if it's a strip mall, they have their accessible parking spaces on one end of the strip mall, and if a restaurant goes in on the other end, it's the same thing. You still have direct access to it. The path is a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of question that logic with the handicap. I think if someone was really to look into that, we're going to have an issue with that. I think we have the opportunity with this parking, especially at this point of the planning, is to make it easier accessible for the people who have that special need of parking, and to convert some of those close spots to that ramp area and the entrance. As someone that works within the community and sits on a planning commission, my number one goal is to make it accessible 100% for everybody, not just people that are able-bodied. And since the size of this remodel is remarkable as opposed to less than 20%, we're stepping on new waters here, and I think it's time to bring stuff up to code and up to a modern standard that is approved nowadays for most buildings that are being built like this or remodeled like this, and relocating those handicap spots in a more direct access, like the building code will say, chapter 1341 will state that has to be the most direct access available, and that doesn't mean 2 long sidewalks down the alley. It's not even a street, it's an alley. I think that this time, that's something we have to really consider from a lawsuit standpoint and from the community service standpoint. I think it's ultra important that we stay as current as possible with all needs of the community, let alone current trends and codes, as far as the parking goes. And I will admit, I really struggle with that number 38, because I read that chapter 3 times again, and I mean, it's easy for you because you see it all the time, but I would have come up with a lot more parking spaces that we need for this. It didn't state when the hours of operation were going to be of the restaurant either.
Sure.
So I didn't know if they're morning, noon, dinner, or what it's going to be. And maybe we don't know that yet, obviously. But we had to open the idea that it could open at 6 a.m. and close at midnight. So those spaces had to be available through that whole time, not just at peak times. I'd say with that formula, there's not enough parking available for this type of use. And just through using our ordinances and going through it, I would say we'd had to have a lot more parking for this, and we have an empty lot to put that parking in if that it was to be used that way.
So where's the disconnect? I mean, because You're showing your math, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
You've got restaurant use and office use.
The disconnect would come from the fact that we formulated this 12, 15 years ago. And it's old. What we're doing now is, we know we have a parking problem already in downtown. And now we're gonna add how many square feet of seating in there? 3,500?
Does that sound
So
right?
it's 7 square foot a person. That's what, 500 people, cut that in half for furniture, up to 200, 250 people, max, at any given time. We don't have enough parking. I mean, if we're looking at peaks, now, of course, you have to look at the extreme when we're in use. I'm just second guessing the formula in itself, even though I know it as an ordinance. I'm questioning that because I know the problems of parking downtown. And it's a constant complaint. And I'm just shocked there isn't people here being at, an open forum, open hearing, public hearing for this, that people aren't here, especially business owners, making a statement about the parking, about this. And I assume they were all notified to the use of this being a CUP, that they were notified that this was going to happen or would be on the table tonight. So that's just my thoughts. Obviously, Ben, like you said, this is what our ordinance says now, and
Correct.
it's prescriptive as can be, but I have a problem with it. That's for this project and projects going forward in general.
So, to be fair, I think it's a true statement that we have to review this proposal with the ordinances we have in place. Right? I think if we broadly take exception to that as a philosophy, I think that's a different discussion for a different day, no less important, but not necessarily the basis for whether this proposal gets recommended to go forward. Is that a fair?
That is very
It's
fair.
a fair assessment, and I
And
agree
I-
with that, up to the part where also as a planning commissioner, I have to look at the ordinances, but I also have to look at the future use of the places I'm conditioning with the current ordinances and say, is that gonna be applicable even 6 months from now or 5 years from now? And I say to myself, in this case, this is not going to be, if we're going to grow as a downtown. I mean,
But so from a planning standpoint, it leads to a more rigorous discussion about the overall philosophy that's been used to date and how it applies going forward with shared parking as an approach.
an immediate need for more parking.
Yeah.
And we are working on that at a staff level. So, one, the overall parking discussion of all the ordinances that Aaron and I have on our list to start reviewing and bringing to you for discussion, that's on the list. But what you'll pick up on in recent council meetings, even for the past year, there's a definite identification that parking needs some attention, and some strategic locations need to be identified to increase our capacity for things beyond just the general day-to-day uses. But to
And I would add, I guess, to my comments, if it makes, the fact that there's nobody here, business owner-wise, the same people that complain to me, because they've known me for how many years in this town, that they're not here and the residents aren't here, it just floors me. So what am I supposed to say then, that I don't approve it because they actually fit within the ordinance? How, it's a catch-22 for me is what I'm kind of getting at. In the long run, I know we have a parking problem, but I would have to accept this, but what I'd really like to see, especially on the accessibility side, is that we work with the developer on this, the property owner, and make some hard suggestions to accessibility. And
I
maybe,
think with those two spaces, there's opportunity to add at least an accessible
Yep.
space right there. So
we're gonna
that's
need at least one,
noted.
just,
Yep.
and that would be the proper place too, because there is room for it there in the sidewalk,
Mm-hmm.
and the extension of the sidewalk would be appropriate. So, it's just a huge concern of mine, because some of the parking that is accessible isn't the best accessibility for the people. And we have to think of every person in the community, not just able-bodied people. So I'll stop preaching about that.
No, I mean, that's why I started with that question is I agree. I strongly support that. While I understand your point, Ben, that there's sort of a global shared attitude about accessible parking stalls, I think that I agree with the philosophy of the shared parking as a whole, but I think when it comes to the accessible stalls, it feels like the spirit of the code wants us to look at this site, and if we're recognizing that it requires 34 or 38, and whatever percentage, whether the math comes out to 1 or 2 stalls, it feels like to meet the spirit of the intent of providing that level of accessibility for customers and for patrons of the city, that you want to have that restriped to meet, even though it may not be required based on shared, that directly adjacent and near the clearest path is where they get marked. And it may result in losing a stall in an overall count, but it feels like the right thing to do.
So can I ask this of you, Ben? When you do figure how many, I'm sure the building official, when he does his plan review, figures how many accessible
Occupants.
spots have to be used. Do you use your number of 38 that from our formula ordinance-wise, or do you do it from a standpoint of the accessibility code? Do you know how that goes down?
It's a complicated answer. I'll try to make it real simple. So what we look at is total counts, because we're talking about 38 here. Those 38 that we're talking about exist today. So if we talk about all of the parking that we have today, we fall into the accessibility code in terms of looking at how many total stalls do we have and what's the criteria in the accessibility code of how many of those total need to be accessible stalls.
Okay, so
So similar to if we were just going to build a parking lot and it had X number of stalls in it, there's a chart the accessibility code has that based on how many total park are in there, here's how many accessible need to be there.
Square footage,
That's what we're doing.
okay.
On a related note, are curb cuts required? I'm having a little bit of a hard time following the accessible route to the front door.
Okay.
So, I mean, and I guess you can expand on how much of this detail is actually part of our site plan review. But it seems topical, and I'm just where the front door is and where the curb cut is and the access.
So which curb cut, when you say curb cut, what are you talking about?
So I think what we're talking about is, where the ramp that kind of comes at an angle meets I'll call it what's hatched as pavers, right? Or are we talking about that's the most practical?
This is an existing ramp. Yep. And then this is the new sidewalk path. So in between those two lines is the route down towards the entrance that's here. Today the entrance is a little bit further north, just bringing it forward with that addition. So the new entrance is this door right here that underneath where it says canopy.
Okay, so out at the street at the corner, that's already sloped down to it's already a ramp. It's going down.
It's not. The only thing that exists is basically this paver area. That's the only thing that's there today. So as part of construction, they'll have to grade out this route and then install the concrete to meet the grades necessary to comply with the accessibility code.
So the
Same thing from here. This is a higher point, and it's basically a ramp down towards that door, that entrance.
So I guess I'm just trying to kind of cross the T's and dot the I's. If we're thinking that, let's say, 1 or 2 stalls are to be accessible, I'm not sure if it's the 2 over to the right, that are marked with 9-foot dimensions, or if it's 2 of the diagonal. But it seems like if that's true, then there's probably the need for a curb cut at
Come
the
off the
corner
aisle.
to come off of the street and get onto that sidewalk circulation.
So let me see if I can answer your question a little bit differently. So this is the condition that's there.
Right, okay, so that's already got a sloped curb
Correct.
that, yes, so that's your,
And as part of the
Accessible
improvements, and I didn't acknowledge this yet, but this, the applicant is taking out this mulch line and paving up to what will be that parking stall right next to it.
yeah, so it would seem that where that is striped right now, that is, those get restriped for stalls, it makes sense that they're accessible, either a single or potentially up to two. I don't know what the math will come out.
Yep.
And then that's a natural path of egress to come out.
To get to that stall or two stalls, whatever that is.
Right, and
To
then
the
get to
front
get to the site egress, the sidewalk within the site.
Okay,
So that's 18, yeah, there'd be plenty of room because 16 feet is all you need for
correct.
van accessible.
8 and 8. Yep.
That would be an ideal, and then we're looking at it and saying, hey, look, it's fully accessible then, you know, it looks like we made the effort to get them as close as possible. And I think that's in good faith for the city in general.
So Ben, can you help clarify, is that, you know, we're always straddling, you know, what is part of our review versus what's a recommendation is,
You haven't said any, even though it's not specifically spelled out in our zoning code, everything that you're talking about is where we've been with the applicant, their engineer, all along, trying to figure out the biggest thing is just this separation of the main entrance and the street of what's the correct path to get to the front door. So I think it's appropriate if you want to make your recommendation with a condition that additional consideration is made to accessible parking on the alley where those two new stalls are being created. I think that is very appropriate.
right? And I would add to that it meets the spirit of the law, recognizing this is a shared parking environment. So it may not be required, but it meets the intent. And then staff with the applicant can review that as this goes forward for how that gets executed in detail, right? Whether those two stalls are the best stalls, but I think with the intent being the proximity to the most natural path of egress, that's what the spirit of the law is intended for, right?
Yep.
So is the actual physical address Tower Boulevard then? That's the front
I
of the
need
building?
to talk to the applicant about that. It's always been Victoria Drive. That's what it has been today, even with the door. The door was there before Tower Boulevard existed. So part of what we might look at, because they are going through that remodel of assigning it a Tower Boulevard address.
Yeah, because I think legal-wise, that's an alley, those handicap spots would be after.
Correct.
Is there some reason we can't claim that as a street? Is it the width or how it was just proposed?
For what reason?
I think there's actually language in the handicap accessibility code. It must be on a approved
I
roadway.
thought it was a public way to which a paved alley would be.
Yep, okay. You could be right.
Some of the nuance you might be alluding to, though, Tom, I'm sorry,
Todd.
Jeez, is that point of access needs to be the common point of access for public. So it can't be one point of access for those that have
Correct.
special requirements versus the most natural front door that's understood by the public.
Correct. So
So
because we have the rest of the parking is also along that alley, I don't see that being a immediate cause for concern.
right, and the common point of entry is actually the midpoint from whether it's on either of the two streets.
Correct.
Yeah.
I don't want to totally get off parking necessarily, but back where the garage door, where they're proposing the garbage stuff, is that something you're going to get to? Or
Yeah.
do we want?
Yeah, I was going to run through the elevations a little bit, and we can kind of talk through some of that information as well. Are you ready? All right. Since the architect's here representing the project, I think he maybe wants to hear more about this. So elevations were included as part of the packet of information for you. This would be the south elevation, so the elevation that would face the clock tower building. Generally, if you're standing kind of outside of Salon Spatoria, this is the view that you would have across the street. Main entrance being here. Part of the addition is a 2-story stairwell that's being added onto the building. As you recall from the existing conditions, there's that existing exterior staircase that goes up to that second level on the outside. That would basically be reconditioned. Here's the existing 2 doors there. So a stairwell being added as part of that. Then the remainder of the addition being just a single story, but having a total height of about 20 feet on either end. And you can see more of a decorative metal work in some of those openings throughout the facade. All of the building addition is focused on brick, glazing, and then some of those metal accents. We do have material samples. Tom, if you want to take a look and pass down. So the brick, the owner worked really hard to try to find something that would be compatible with the existing brick that's on the building. And then the color sample that you see is the intended color of all of the mullion, some of the window facade, and any metalwork on the building to be that green. If you recall, kind of the upper story or the oldest part of the existing building does have like green framed windows. So trying to keep some of that context moving forward, even though all of those existing windows end up getting removed and replaced with this addition. This is the west elevation, so the side that would face the Noterman building. Here, and I don't know if this is the appropriate time for where you were headed, Todd, but that drive aisle leads towards this new trash enclosure. As you can see, it is brick surround and does have more of a slatted gate proposed. There's kind of a portico being created, so that this area here is an existing door that gets reconditioned that would go into the kitchen. And if you went into this area, there's also a door back into here that leads towards the fire sprinkler room. So it would be an open air area, kind of step back, small courtyard, if you're not familiar with that, small courtyard being created here. The east elevation, this would be what is facing the alley. So those parking spaces we were talking about generally would fall kind of facing the corner of this building here. And then the rear of the building, this actually will be fairly obstructed in terms of existing vegetation that remains on the north half of the site. You can see some infill of some existing openings that are there. Again, kind of this lower back portion of the building being that kitchen. And then the 2 additions, patio here, and then you can see the lower brick trash enclosure here. I don't know if you want to jump back, Todd, to
Yeah, if you don't
ask
mind,
whatever questions
unless
you
someone
have
else
about
wants
that.
to, has a question or wants to.
Is there any public access to the roof area there for eating, drinking, or anything?
Not at this point.
Not at this point, okay.
Yeah, it'd be great if you could step forward.
No, not at this point. The owner would like to make that, a potential future opportunity, but that would change parking completely. It would change access to the second floor. We'd have to add another means of egress, an elevator, and all those sorts of things at that point.
Okay.
Lauren, really quick, could you say your name and
Oh,
address?
I'm sorry, Lauren Morshin with Lanier Morshin Architects.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since you're there, I had another question. This is maybe for you and for Ben, but this is back from a site plan review perspective and thinking about this use now becoming more intense with a restaurant use and deliveries. I mean, it would seem wise to, if we're now using this new area to the west for deliveries, to avoid a situation where we've got large trucks out in the road and impeding traffic. It feels like the delivery strategy is probably different than from when Enki was here.
Yep, and that's why you'll see in the site plan, so the existing driveway ends up getting removed and widened. So it is 24 feet in width, and part of the what the civil engineer looked at was, would the size trucks that would be doing deliveries, can they back in to that building and still not go over any of the curbing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I'm thinking more length. Like, is it shorter box trucks that are making delivery, or
Right.
do we have a longer truck that's going to, not from the width but the length standpoint, back up, leave room for staging and offloading equipment, but then the front of the nose of the truck is sitting out in the roadway.
Right.
I can't control their delivery process. And certainly if, semi-trailer backed in there, it'd be sticking out into the road. The intention was, though, that a typical, like you said, box truck could back in and stay off the sidewalk and road when they're unloading, so.
Yeah. And I'm not necessarily asking you to
Right.
step out of bounds for things that are beyond your control, but I'm just thinking from a site plan review,
Yep.
understanding traffic patterns, that seems like this group should be talking about that at least,
Yep.
and either understanding how it can be mitigated or managed, or, to be honest, this might not be the best location for deliveries.
Sure.
Is there a different way to think of the site?
Yeah, part of what we've done, staff and the owner, is talk through what is that delivery look like and what's the best case scenario given some of the existing conditions around it. What typically happens today for all the restaurants that are in place is we have one truck that comes in, they end up parking on Tower Boulevard, drops off at School of the Wise, they come down the alley, they sit on the alley, they deliver to Victoria House, they go around the corner, then they sit on Quamaclet, and they unload whatever Vic's Bar and Grill needs, and then they head out of town from there. So in the ideal situation, well, and Floyd's has internal circulation off their off-street parking lot, so that's not, and so does Noble Lion. But in terms of the three other uses and what's there today, the goal here was to provide as much capacity off-site, off the street, where even if their cab did nose out into one lane of traffic, it was going to be easier to navigate around just the nose of that vehicle than having the entire truck sit on side of the building, regardless of where that delivery location ended up. Because there was evaluation, I don't know how many times you ended up redrawing this edition, of is it off the alley using that existing gravel drive in? Is it off of Tower? This seemed like the most logical location for what can accommodate all things, where the kitchen kind of wanted to naturally live, and then how do we accommodate deliveries. So without pulling back into the site and creating a full-on loading zone for them, which isn't really possible because of the curve and the slope of the road, this seemed like the best case scenario. The other thing that, at least from a staff perspective, gave us a little bit more comfort is the talk about that one-way having a more permanent solution. Anyone that's heading up to that intersection is only dealing with someone coming around that corner going away, not coming towards you. So,
Right.
and deliveries, I would say they only range 15, 20 minutes, and they're once a day, and it's usually midday when there's less traffic volumes or people around. So all of those factors definitely have been a point of discussion.
So do you feel like the city has mechanisms in place where if it's a short box truck and it's, a slight impediment to the road, it's not that big deal, but if we're finding that larger trucks, say a semi-trailer were to come in.
Correct.
That there's mechanisms in place to have the conversations that that's probably more appropriate, stopping on the street or one of the side streets and allowing the offloading,
Correct.
not jamming up the intersection, backing up to this particular loading dock area, for example.
Right, or up into the intersection, which is kind of the biggest level of angst that I ever get is when you have a huge obstruction within a very close proximity to an intersection.
Yeah.
And when I inquired about that elevation, that's exactly what my point was gonna be too. We have, section 109, 122, off-street loading design and maintenance. It basically says you don't have it on a main street. That's a siteway, that's our main street, and we're throwing garbage and loading and unloading trucks there. There's an alley, we designed an alley for a reason. When that alley went in, that was for deliveries. That's so they had access. There used to be dirt back there when C.H. Carpenter was there and you couldn't get through. There was a building. They cut that building down and made an alley in there just for deliveries for these businesses that were going in. It wasn't to put them on Main Street. I think that's an eyesore. It's the wrong use of the sidewalk, the street, the building. I'm totally against that, period. If you come down the deliveries, I keep hearing they're gonna be 15 minutes for these restaurants, and those trucks sit out front of here, for half an hour at a time. And it's, especially with the construction going on, it doesn't help either. But it's all wrong the way it's set up. Those buildings are existing. We have a great opportunity here to do the proper thing and reconfigure. Maybe the patio has to move, but they have plenty of surface area to have their own drive-in from the alleyway to back in, pull into that parking lot to the east, back in where that patio slatted, get a full-size semi backed in there and unload right into that kitchen. Garbage could be in the exact same place. The garbage truck can back up right there and pick that garbage up. I'm not trying to design the building, but I am trying to make it once again usable for our consumers, the people in the town, to get around that area. And having a loading dock on Main Street, Victoria, is not a good idea. It's a poor idea.
So it sounds like there may have been some discussions about alternative approaches.
Over the entire kind of iteration of thinking about what this addition could be, yes. But the solutions that had even it was more the delivery route to the building from the alley still involved a truck sitting on the alley. Because there isn't enough depth even with the existing building where it is to back a semi-trailer down that path that they've had. It actually needed to get enlarged. And I don't know that there's adequate depth there either for a full semi-trailer.
To Commissioner Child's point, if you were to move it to the other side, the access through the alley, wasn't there an opportunity to increase the parking where the trash area is already outlined? Kind of solving for two problems. I know, albeit small. Well,
I guess I'm not
cost.
following what
If you were to go ahead and just designate some parking where the trash area would be, right? If you were to move the loading to the patio or to the north where the patio was intended to be, based again on the suggestion that's already out there, you could actually put in another 4 or 5 stalls where the trash would be, right? Does that make sense?
trying to say parking over on the west side of
Yeah, where the garage door is now, right? You still
there's not room to do that level of parking, no. It would have to be the 24-foot drive aisle is what you'd need on an off-street parking lot just to get vehicles in. You might get a couple spaces, maybe, but because this is right at the intersection, you wouldn't be able to say increase on-street parking down this part because you wouldn't want cars at the intersection backing into the intersection.
Plus, I think you lose as many in the alley creating
Correct.
that drive
So,
aisle.
yeah,
as you gain.
It would be a
You'd
swap
just
of
be- it would
parking
be a swap.
spaces. I mean, you could fit 2 in there easily at the parallel that they're at now.
Well,
Eliminate 2 on the east side and back the trucks in because they have that whole parking lot to pull forward and back in alongside that building on the north side. A side that's, like you said, obscured now anyway with greenery. And they're gonna have to move that huge electrical transformer connection box that's there.
They're moving the transformer anyway.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's
So-
an alley for a reason, and Main Street is for a reason. I think the discussions on some of that stuff should be after these meetings too, so we're not sitting here now, where these ideas are supposed to go forward and go towards that meeting with the property owner and the architect and everybody, where they can use them and create something maybe different that would, with ideas from the commission. We shouldn't be here deciding whether or not we're gonna accept what's drawn, because it's already been thought about. I'm feeling forced into making a decision on this, and that's not the way I really want it to be all the time.
Well, just so I can understand where you're coming from, Todd, if the solution was that large delivery trucks needed to basically deliver to this building from the alley, and anything small enough that would not obstruct the street could use the loading zone that they have, is that what we're talking about? 'Cause
No, we're not. We're talking about totally removing that loading dock from that area and the garbage on that present street. We're talking totally moving that. I wouldn't accept any alternate, because the minute a small truck goes there, the big truck's right behind it. I've seen it. And that's just how it operates. They're gonna take the easiest access for sure, and that's on Main Street. They'll just pull over. And if you go downtown Minneapolis, this is basically downtown Minneapolis with the space, how tight it is, they just stop right on the street. They're not gonna, if there's an easier access, they're gonna go to it, no matter what size the truck is, or what the rules are. There's no way you're gonna get a sheriff out here in 20 minutes to give him a ticket for doing something that they don't have an ordinance, or it's not necessarily illegal, just because we wanna work with the restaurant and say, hey, only small trucks here. It won't work that way. Unless there's something solid as far as a finable ordinance type situation. But having the loading dock, just from an aesthetic point of view, with the garbage, isn't acceptable to me on Main Street either.
Well, I think I'll expand on that a little bit, because I'm always trying to put it in the context of what's our role in this review. And I actually appreciate the conversation, because where I was starting was thinking about what this proposed use was doing to a primary street that is becoming increasingly prominent in our downtown area. Todd, I think you took it to the next level, which is recognizing that that is actually a back of house function. The reason why I was having questions or concern about it is because it was inherently a back of house function that we're putting in a front of house location. And I think if we were to zoom out a little bit about what our role on the planning commission being is thinking about the fabric of the downtown now, and with the recent addition of the other building and the streetscape that's being created, I'm tending to agree with Todd that this back of house function on a front of house road doesn't feel like the right organization on this site. And so we're talking about some of the symptoms of what that means, but I think the reality is that we've now, with this proposal in front of us, we've shifted what was off the alley and more natural now being more prominent up front. And in fact, it's not our place to make decisions tonight and come up with an alternative building design. But I have to admit that when I'm looking at the plan, there was already this fragmentation of multiple patios, separated by this back of house function in the corner that I was trying to also understand. But I think that's also part of the broader discussion in terms of, so now there's a patio off the alley and adjacent to the greenway, which I get it. But we've now got a back of house function off of a primary road. It feels like we're on the right path here in terms of questioning some of the big ideas. But I think that, so Todd, you had had a comment there about I don't think it's our decision to make. It's not that we're suggesting you must do this or swap these or switch the patio with the. I think that what's really before us is whether we want to recommend approval of the conditional use permit as presented.
And the site plan and building materials.
And the site plan and building materials. So they're kind of intertwined. My sense is that from a building material standpoint, it's fairly straightforward and well thought through in terms of maintaining the character, and it's durable materials, and there's some accents, and I think generally materiality pretty well complies with what our downtown standards are. Mm-hmm. But thinking about the parking, I think we had some feedback on the parking about accessibility, which I don't think we have to identify the solution. It's just some natural next steps. And then with the site plan review, I think that's the one that stands out in terms of how this fits into the broader downtown.
So I don't think any of the comments about the loading function or the trash function being in a position that's maybe not entirely ideal is wrong. In terms of the ownership and kind of what Lauren's worked through, as well as the site civil engineer, is from what exists today. I realize you'd always want to take every opportunity to remove things you don't like today, but that function of delivery on that west side of the site is there today. And I would say if we're comparing what this looks like to what this looks like, I think part of the question I'd just like to understand a little bit more is if that was a function that's there, just making it more functional, and aesthetically it's actually a larger element of that full elevation, is that the move in the right direction or not?
I lean towards the fact that the change of use and the amount of use that delivery area is going to get is becoming unacceptable for it to continue as it is. And with the percentage of remodeling, addition, and everything we're putting on, I mean, anything greater than 20%, this is our duty to subscribe to our ordinances that are written. And this is the time to do it on a remodel. Otherwise, we'd never change anything that's existing. And we'd allow it as it is, no matter how it is, unless we absolutely knew it was a terrible hazard.
So,
And that's just my opinion. I'm not trying to speak for anyone else.
What is the delivery ordinance? Is there a way to bring that up? I think you had
It's
mentioned it, Todd.
It's off-street loading, design, and maintenance.
I could be wrong, and it may not be in line with our ordinance, but, and again, I may be mistaken, but I feel like when I come through town and I see deliveries for those restaurants, it's normally like a short semi, and it sits out there. But it seems like to me, it's at a time of day that's not really obstructing anything. Doesn't seem bothersome to me. I know it may interfere with other people and stuff, but I'd be curious to see what the ordinance, here it is.
It's an existing condition when you see it now, or we're changing. In my opinion, we're changing the use and the condition in which it's.
So now's the time to set the new precedent.
Well, not new,
Or
the in place.
or start enforcing
Ordinance,
that
yeah.
ordinance, I guess.
Because it nicks on everything as far as location, access, landscape and screening, design 50%. I mean,
So the only thing I'm trying really hard to understand, I do know what this says, but in terms of dealing with existing functions downtown, I can't remove them just because another one's coming in. So I'm trying to figure out what is the correct solution of dealing with loading that does happen today on the alley, on Tower, and on Quamaclet that relates to how likely the same delivery truck is going to hit this one. They might have more or some different ones than some of the other businesses that are around. But usually that's how it ends up working, is you see one or two of these same trucks that deliver to all, and they're stopping multiple times. So here we are trying to have the option to pull some of it off site, and even if the alley is the desired location as part of their site plan approval, if the larger trucks need to deliver from the alley and use the sidewalk routes to get to the building, if you all view that that's in the best interest of the public, I can definitely follow that, and that can be one of the conditions of the approval.
Can we talk a little bit more about the context?
Yeah.
Because I think context matters in this case.
Sure.
And I totally understand your point, Ben, that there is a use that exists today in that location. So I'm sensitive to that, but I equally understand that the nature of the use is changing. I also it was in the staff report that the applicant reserves the right to develop the rest of the site in the future, right? So there may be a point in time in which another building is constructed, either whether it's attached to this one or standalone. But when you think about the nature of this street, if we go towards the south, for example, that is there's a relationship to the street that those businesses, and if you pan to the right, I don't know if the new development is in.
It's not.
But now if you pan to the right again, these are all buildings which relate to the street, relate to the sidewalk. We talk about a walkable and friendly downtown Victoria, but then we get to this building and there's the back of house function that exists. Whether there's a truck parked there or not, it's still a break in that. As the use potentially intensifies with additional businesses on the corner as it develops, its use may again intensify, and it's a garbage facility. I mean, as well-intentioned as we are, that breaks the street front, and it's very different than if you would imagine that patio were to extend the face of the building. And that then leads to the next development in the future, and again, has some relationship to the sidewalk and the street front. So it feels out of place, and it feels like this scale of remodel and recognizing both the change of use in this site and the future development on the property adjacent, this feels like the right opportunity to think about locating back of house functions in the right spot.
I would tend to agree, and I'm kind of wondering, you mentioned there's a number of different iterations that was done. Was there consideration to moving this location? And if so, what were the challenges associated with it?
The biggest thing has to do with grade. So grade and parking. So if we look at just the site as it is today, the building sits down from kind of the high point of where you'd start to locate things even on site here. So you're either removing existing parking along the alley to create some kind of route to a back of house function off the alley here. Or you're trying to use the existing conditions somewhat as they are, and I think Lauren has done a good job of trying to downplay the fact that there's a back of house function on the elevation with the treatment of having kind of this continuous, it's almost like a flying buttress component to keep that elevation flush. And even the enclosure itself being bricked, you're really just dealing with the doors that you could have a hollow core door or two that was here, and it's basically trying to blend it out and not make it the focus. The focus ends up being on that retail component.
When you say the grade on the other side, does that pose physical challenges from moving that site, or is it mainly the parking, the loss of parking?
So if you were to look right here, you can see that it's a slope up to a grade there, which if you're creating a full loading dock, makes some sense, but to get a truck backed into what a loading dock is challenging. You're removing more parking, the grade's not there, and even just to have a route per se, you're still eliminating parking and the truck, as I've said before, ends up being parked on the alley.
So Ben, real quick with that picture, isn't the corner of the building going to be 10, 12 feet to the north?
Corner.
A
of the
little
building,
more, the corner of the new building, the addition sticks out to the north more?
That's just the patio space, and
No,
it's
but-
actually,
Isn't that where the new addition will be? Isn't there an addition to the north side of the building?
no,
Oh, just on the
nope.
front. So, yeah, so that, I mean, that would be a natural driveway. I mean, if it's small trucks like I keep hearing, that's easy for them to go up a 6% grade, you know? It just doesn't make any sense at all that that can't be utilized.
But
See, I understand the elevation problem on Tower Boulevard and that, I fully understand that, and stairs are never an idea to go down towards a building. Usually you want them going away from a building, you know, as far as accessibility goes.
Yep.
But that's obviously a challenge there, and it was met pretty well.
But we'd forego losing the parking.
Well, you still have that driveway out front that you'd pick up these two spots, 16 feet here you have to back the truck in. If you took 2 spots away here, striped it, bollards. And the
I
line's
just
fairly
don't know
well,
that you can actually make that turn
which turns out.
backing in.
Well, you
only
pull
down.
into the parking lot, actually, and then back straight in from there. That would be the idea, coming north, and you go east, and you back your truck right in there.
I think the point that we're making too, Ben, is that this is an alternative that I think what's becoming more clear to me hasn't been fully explored. That we should at least do the science on it to determine if it's feasible or not and what the impacts are. Because I would tend to agree with what both Todd and Jeff are saying, just from that's our main street coming in, and this is an opportunity. It's a significant improvement, and quite honestly, I really like what I see here from a use and from a design standpoint. I think would be a tremendous asset to Victoria, and I'd like to see it happen. But I think these little what look like little things can turn into be big things as we continue to grow as a community. And I think we're doing the right thing by taking it into consideration today. And at the end of the day, we may end up, it looks like that original proposal does make sense because of the other challenges, but I'm getting the sense that this isn't fully explored. That's my opinion.
And I think it's a great project overall, and I'm glad to see some use being coming out of there. And I hate to not make a recommendation tonight based on one thing that I think that can be corrected, solved, changed, however you want to deem it. And overall, I think it's great.
I mean, what are I guess that's a good question on process. What's our alternatives for going forward? We seem to have an issue with what's being proposed, so
Yep.
I don't know if any of us, I mean, a vote would tell kind of where we stand on it, but do we really want to put it to that vote if we have
Yeah,
concerns?
if there's not a level of comfort with what is presented tonight, I'd prefer to see the group table action on it versus not making a recommendation or denying the recommendation. And if there's some things like this back of house function that could be brought back at a future meeting to have a little bit greater discussion with answers to those, I would prefer to see that. I mean, certainly that the applicant wasn't able to be here for some personal issues. And I know time is becoming of the essence, just given the season that we're in, of if something's going to get started, it's better to get it done in the near future than waiting further.
So the benefit of tabling it, Ben, is that it would enable some additional legwork to be done, and it could come before us at the next planning commission meeting, right? As opposed to if we act on it, it then has to go to council, and then based on what happens there, there's some additional timing needed before it can actually come back to us again. Is that true?
Right, and I would say it's more challenging for a project that doesn't get a recommendation from the planning commission to be well received at the council level.
Right.
The questions that you have here are generally going to be similar to what the council is also going to have, particularly because as we recap what kind of feedback or what kinds of things did this group say to inform the council of things that they should look at, it would be better to kind of round out an understanding of these specific elements that I guess are still of question to the planning commission before it moves forward.
Yeah. It feels like that's, well, I'll go out on a limb and say it feels like that's where that may be the best course. I think that generally it feels like the parking is good with some additional accessibility provisions to be considered, which could probably be, we can move forward with that.
Well, I think your notes here, we can inform what that final resolution of recommendation looks like to talk about the accessible stalls, and also something, if we have some more time, we can work on providing better answers for what that looks like.
Yeah. So just for the sake of discussion, I know that we've spoken openly. Do the rest of you generally agree with some of those concerns, or does anybody, I guess, explicitly not agree with that? And what I mean, it sounds like the three of us have spoken openly that generally we feel like the back of house function net wants to be considered for potentially relating to the alley as opposed to the primary roadway. Okay. If I were just to like oversimplify it.
I would agree. My only caveat would be is not, I'd like to explore this further. I'm not suggesting that I wouldn't agree with the front of the house as long as I get a better comfort as far as what we could do in the alleyway. So
that's fair.
I think that's exactly my feeling. I like the use. I like the building materials. It's not that I wouldn't move forward with it, but I would like the opportunity to explore that alley as a possible back house function.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I love the idea of having another restaurant down there too, right? I mean, we'll talk about maybe some things that might inhibit it a little bit, but ultimately the overall goal of getting another usable piece of property downtown only enhances the experience already. So again, I totally agree with everything we're saying, but let's not let that stop us from what ultimately is the better idea, or my opinion of a better idea is getting more usable space downtown for the residents of Victoria.
I would agree. I think it's a great asset to the community. I would like to see an alternative plan that the parking comes in like we've been talking about, but I wouldn't outright say no to the current plan. But I would like to see an alternative plan so I can balance the two and see which one is a better idea for the community.
Thanks. And Todd, it sounds like you're a pretty strong advocate to consider the adjustment. I'll say that I'll strongly advocate for locating the back of house function not on the primary street. But I will just add, because I think there's some additional conversations to be had in this process, that if we find ourselves in a position where that's just simply not practical, I think it's the right thing to do from a city development standpoint. But if something we learn is just not practical, if we were to find ourselves back with the position as proposed, I'll just share the feedback that it feels like it wants to be incorporated in a stronger manner with the building. Because right now it feels like, even though I understand the intent was to minimize it and put it behind some low barriers and some low fencing, yep. I think one of the things that makes the existing building maybe less obtrusive is that it's actually incorporated in the building. So it feels like it wants to be under a higher mass that is a continuation of the building that feels a little bit more enclosed and part of the building, as opposed to a more conventional treatment of a trash enclosure that we often see elsewhere at strip malls around the area. Okay. Not as a criticism, I'm just using that as a descriptor of what like generally this is trying to do, is minimize it, but it feels like it wants to be part of the building, similar to how it is today.
Okay.
So
So just to put it out there, I think that some additional work can be done to provide, like, what do those alternatives mean for the project? The hardest part of trying to physically get some of these things to move from where the project is today is the location of where that kitchen lives, and providing a most direct access so that almost to the, Todd, you didn't say this specifically, so I'm not trying to say exactly what you had, but people take the path of least resistance when it's available to them. So if you look at delivery truck drivers, depending on where the entrance to that kitchen ends up being, is going to drive a lot more of where the truck gets parked and the route that they take to get there than anything else that might be purposely put in place on the site. So I at least want to acknowledge that a lot of these things probably aren't able to be changed because of the exercise that Lauren's been doing with the applicant and the restaurant owner of trying to identify the internal circulation versus the external circulation. So I at least want to acknowledge that quite a bit of work has gone into. I mean, I did say that other iterations have been done. A lot of it was an exercise of based on the existing conditions surrounding it, because you can't alter a ton of the site. I mean, the four bounds of this property are pretty well set, and I think, personal opinion, a lot of the community gets anxious if we start pulling some of the existing elements away to accommodate new uses. So I think there's definitely a balance there, but that's at least what's happened to date.
Yeah, and I would agree with the point about the people getting anxious, especially in this town. They don't like a lot of change,
Right.
Drastic change, but it's part of life. And they're, they've been dealing with it pretty good with some of the stuff. But, maybe to your point you mentioned about us planning as a commission the site plan around interior circulation. That's backwards. Site plans should be established first and approved, and see if they're accessible and feasible before any interior circulation stuff is done. That's kind of a ground-up base for a lot of buildings that go on strip malls or whatever it is. You have to be able to have an outside building that's functional, that you can get to and lives within our ordinances. Then you can figure out what you're going to do on the inside of that building. So maybe going forward, we can get developers here earlier for the site plan, or before they have their mindset on something, and have a restaurateur involved or the property owner involved at that level. We should be seeing it before then, and making some of these suggestions before we have basically a final draft in front of us.
Any insights from your perspective?
Well, I know we've definitely looked at the different options for bringing this, the trash and the delivery in from the other side. And part of it has to do with the amount of building we wind up with, because if we're going to bring the delivery in from the alley, we basically lose the dining hall, which is the main portion of this, to get up to the building. You have to realize there is going to be another building on the other half of the site. We can't just drive across the north side of the building and use up that property. And so the main dining hall is on, the alley side. And so to shorten that up, it reduces, a great deal of the function of the space. When this is developed, there's sort of a bar restaurant in the front corner and a banquet hall in the back corner, which is the portion that would be taken up, by your deliveries and your trash at that point. So that's also where you need your view out of the dining hall. If you look at the plan, the dining hall has windows looking toward the north, toward that site. And that's obviously not where you put your trash and your deliveries from the way the building functions.
But what happens when the rest of the site gets developed in the future and takes away that view?
Well, that'll be part of the consideration taken, but
And where is that building going to put their trash and their back of house?
yeah, we're not.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just, those are hypothetical questions
Right,
that,
right.
if we're looking at this from the long view, I think it's fair to ask those kinds of questions in terms of how it influences the development of this site, anticipating the ultimate development of the adjacent site. And even though I hear what you're saying, that those are assets to, the patio in this location and the views in this location, but that may be ultimately all for naught in the future when those things go away, and then the result is potentially, back of house where we wouldn't have preferred it, and the views no longer exist in the future when something else is developed that obscure it. It may not turn out that way, but it's one scenario to, I think, factor in.
Did we see a tentative floor plan that maybe helps us understand that? Or is there nothing like
Understand
that?
what?
Like a tentative,
On the site, on the,
yeah.
There was a floor plan included in
I,
that.
yeah, I wasn't
I
sure
don't
if you
think
pulled
we
it
can,
up tonight yet.
Lay out the kitchen.
Yeah, the layout.
yeah, it's in there.
Just takes a minute to load. Come on.
So this is all kitchen.
Yep.
I mean, there's,
So this back area of the existing building is where the kitchen is proposed. The dining area, as Lauren is referring to it, is this area that's right, basically alley would be here. Alley and parking would be here.
I mean, the obscuring of that for that access is minimal as opposed to all the other open frontage of the dining areas as far as windows and light, and that's minimal, especially with the tree cover that's there and that planting of 4 other large trees or trees next to that patio area. You're not gonna be able to see out those windows to the lake. I mean, I don't know, that's,
Yeah, I don't know that we're going to solve this, nor do I think it's our role to solve it. I don't know, Ben. It feels like the right course of action is to table the discussion, to allow additional consideration of feedback shared tonight. From a procedural standpoint, is it as simple as one of us making a motion to do so?
Motion and a second, and
Okay.
then a vote.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and move that we table this topic to allow further discussion and evaluation of feedback shared tonight. Is there a second?
Can I ask you to modify that? That you specify
Absolutely.
that it will come back at the next planning commission date?
With the goal that this come back before Planning Commission at our next meeting,
October 3rd.
October 3rd, 2017. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you for the discussion. And I guess from there, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Next, we have council meeting updates.
I don't have a ton for you on the previous full council meeting, but I would note that the council did meet in a special, more of a workshop session last night to talk about the Amazon Headquarters 2 RFP that's out, and talking about whether or not Victoria should consider submitting some information to the state as having a potential site. The site that we had talked about was down near the intersection of County Road 10 and 11. Ultimately, they decided it wouldn't be in the city's best interest to put a proposal together for that scale of a project, 50,000 jobs. When they started getting some numbers about some of the other major employers in the Twin Cities, it far exceeds any of the other employers that you'd think about. So, but they did enjoy having the conversation about thinking about what is the right type of use down in that kind of growth area of Victoria. So certainly a worthwhile discussion, and something I know that they've acknowledged keeping in mind as we work through our comprehensive plan process. And generally we did stream it, so if you wanted to even watch and see what the dialogue was like last night, feel free to do that. It is on our website. In terms of the last full council meeting, just pull it up to jog my memory. The alley that we've been referring to has now officially been renamed to Randy's Way in memorial of Randy Miller, who passed away this past spring. So I'll do my best in the future to try to correct my references to that road to being Randy's Way. Otherwise, there wasn't anything of particular note other than the minor lot split that Aaron referenced under the Hill Point subdivision. So the developer was looking to try to split off that existing homestead parcel, all the lot lines. You saw it again tonight at the final plat. What ends up happening is the new owner of that home, if they acquire it before the final plat gets recorded, they simply have to sign off on the final plat, but all of the lots and everything related to the project didn't change. It was just a way of separating what can be developed from what's being retained on that existing piece. Otherwise, it might be a good idea. It's not necessarily a previous council meeting update, but you all should have received an email from me earlier today about a joint meeting with the planning of the Planning Commission, Council, and Parks and Recreation on Monday, October 16th at 7 o'clock in the evening to do a workshop on our comprehensive plan. By that time, we will have some options available to look at those two growth areas that we included in our comp plan. So one area that we've called the south area, which is south of Marsh Lake Road, bounded by county roads 11, 10, and 43. Our consultant's been working on some land use, transportation, and parks and recreation options for that area, as well as the west area, which is generally west of our current city limits between 5 and Pearson's Lake and Laketown Road. So a large amount of the discussion we like to have with this group, the Council and Parks and Rec, is of those options that are made, and we'll have some feedback from some landowners at that time, as well as the steering committee in general, is what do these groups think in terms of feedback on where those different options provide opportunity for the community moving forward.
You said you sent an email out earlier today? I didn't receive it.
It should have been a calendar invite. You didn't.
Anybody else use it either?
Did you?
No, I didn't see anything.
Check your outlook.
Okay, I'll check the invite. You should receive it later tonight then. If you weren't, I plugged in. I have you all in a group email link. Yeah, so maybe someone else will be there. That'll be fun. But I'll get that fixed, so you will get that. But Monday, October 16th is the night that we're looking at for that, and again at 7 p.m. If for some reason you can't come, that I understand, but as many of you that can be there, we'd really like to have you there for that. Otherwise, that's all I have for council meeting updates.
All right, anybody else, anything to add on council meeting? No? Otherwise, moving on to item 5 on the agenda is miscellaneous. Anybody have items for miscellaneous? Hearing none, I'll move that we adjourn. Is there a second?
Second?
All those in favor? Aye. Have a good evening.